So first of all, I just want to go over a little housekeeping about how everyone gets to ask questions. And we want to really encourage everyone out there to ask questions. It's a really unique opportunity to um, have the ability to ask live questions of one of the true experts in a field. So please take advantage of that. If you'd like to ask a live question, you can click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll call on you, at which point you'll need to unmute your microphone by pressing the unmute button. It's pretty straightforward. Or you can submit written by using the question and answer, so the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. So please do not use the chat feature. We want to try to keep that clean. It'll really complicate my ability with my feeble processing power here. If that thing gets flooded with chit chat, it'll be really difficult to sort out the questions. So one, you can raise your hand for live questions, or two, use a Q&A to ask written questions. Hopefully that's all clear. So we'll get going. It's truly an honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor George Loewenstein co-founded the field of behavioral economics and is a leader in the field of neuroeconomics. He works as a professor of economics and psychology at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George is a co-director of Carnegie Mellon's Center for Behavioral Decision Research, a true cross-disciplinary collaborative effort. He's also the director of behavioral economics at the Center for Health Incentives at the Leonard Davis Institute of the University of Pennsylvania. George received his PhD from Yale University in 1985 and has since held positions and been affiliated with many of the world's best academic institutions. He's a past president of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has done groundbreaking work on the role of emotions in decision making over time, curiosity, adaptation, and risk-taking behavior, to mention a few topics. To give you an idea of the both quality and extent of George's work, he has an H index of 143. So the H index means that he's written 143 articles or books with at least 143 citations on each of them. So how the heck did we ever get connected with someone this far out of our league? Well, in recent years, George has collaborated with Andrea Manberg and her colleagues at the Center for Avalanche Research and Education, or CARE, at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Andrea introduced George and me this summer when George was planning a backpacking trip in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. Fellow Sawtooth Avalanche Center forecaster Chris Lundy and I did some brainstorming, and Chris came up with a plan for an arduous 5 to 6 day off-trail traverse of a good chunk of the Sawtooth Mountains, including scrambles and some climbs of remote peaks. So given that George has been and will continue to be on the short list for the Nobel Prize in Economics until he's awarded that honor, I had to ask Chris, are you sure we're not going to kill these guys? They're flying in from Pittsburgh and doing this burly route off the couch. Well, George obviously survived, and he raved about the trip. I don't know George well, but I get the sense his love of the mountains and fitness compare favorably to his intellectual drive. Without further ado, Professor George Loewenstein.
Thank you, Scott. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Scott, it's funny that you said something about you guys being privileged to have me as a speaker, because I was going to say this is one of the most unusual audiences I've ever had, and I kind of feel like I've been invited to hang out with the cool kids in middle school. I'm not saying that from any personal experience, because I don't think I ever was invited to hang out with the cool kids in middle school. But anyway, finally, I get to have that experience. Okay, I'm going to be talking about behavioral economics and avalanche decision-making. And you've probably heard about avalanche decision-making, but maybe not of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is the application of insights and research findings from psychology to economics. So economics usually assumes that people are kind of rational decision makers. Behavioral economics tries to kind of enrich the vision of the individual decision maker. And I'm going to be, and I should thank Andrea Manberg, who has become a dear friend since I visited Tromsø and introduced me to you cool guys. and she's an affiliate of this CARE, Center for Avalanche Research and Education, which I gave a talk to a few weeks ago, and also heard a talk from Jordy Hendricks, who is standing next to her in this picture, and I learned a lot from his talk, some of which is incorporated into my talk today. All right, let me begin. Let me begin with a riddle. The riddle is, how is snow like a bunny rabbit? That's the riddle. Let me say, the riddle is not, how is a bunny rabbit like snow? It's, in which case, if that were the riddle, you might immediately think about a snowshoe hare. But the riddle is, how is snow like a bunny rabbit? I'm not going to answer that immediately, but I will come back to it. All right, so I study behavioral economists like myself. We study decision-making, and there's a lot of important situations in which people expose themselves to small, low probability risks, but with momentous possible downsides. So small probability of something really bad happening, like seatbelts when you make a decision whether to wear a seatbelt in the car. Probably more relevant for a bunch of us, whether to wear a helmet if you're bicycling or motorcycling, or I guess skiing. Unprotected sex, small chance of very bad consequences. And the most recent is, of course, COVID, where we're all making decisions all the time about whether to expose ourselves to the risk of catching COVID. Let me also say something else I wanted to say, which is to thank you all for listening to this talk today, because I know it's such a tense, whatever your political persuasion is, it's such a tense time for all of us. I noticed this morning that a whole lot of my students didn't show up for class, I assume for that reason. So given how many situations are with these small probabilities of very bad outcomes, it's very important to understand the psychology of decision-making in these situations. And traveling in snow country, like skiing or driving through avalanche terrain, is clearly one of these situations, much like the ones that I just mentioned. The probability of an accident, and since this is the Avalanche Association, specifically the probability of an avalanche in any episode of risk-taking is small. And there are, like many of the other types of risks that I mentioned, for example, sexual risk-taking, the psychic and also in some cases economic benefits. There are psychic and economic benefits to taking risks. So what I'm going to be doing today is trying to apply some of the lessons that we've learned from doing research on these other domains to avalanche-related risk-taking, and also to some degree vice versa. All right, as I mentioned, I gave this talk to CARE a few weeks ago. The CARE audience consisted mainly of backcountry skiers, but then I got an email from Scott, who told me that the audience in this talk was going to be a little bit different. Scott said that a lot of you are either avalanche makers or mitigators. That is, you work for ski areas or in highway departments of state government, and also that there's a number of avalanche avoiders in the audience, like guides, forecasters, educators, who, and as Scott wrote, behave more like the skilled backcountry skiers you presented to before. Here are some of the elements of decision-making that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the role. Scott mentioned that I've done some research on emotions, the role of emotions in risk-taking. I'll be talking a little bit about that. I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon called empathy gaps, decisions from experience, sunk costs, boredom, the power of goals, peer effects, and conflicts of interest. And given this long list, I better plunge right in. All right, let me begin by talking about some work I did on risk, what I called risk as feelings. It's about the role of emotions in risk-taking. The dominant model of risk-taking in economics is something called the expected utility model, which says that when we decide whether to take a risks, we basically think about the probabilities of different outcomes and how we would feel about those outcomes occurring. The expected utility theory doesn't do a very good job of explaining a wide range of situations in which people derive pleasure from taking risks, things like gambling or skiing, in which this was actually a controversial statement that I made 2 weeks ago, but I think I will defend it. I think the risk to some degree the point of the activity. I don't think that, for example, backcountry skiing would be nearly as fun if it was completely risk-free, but we can debate that in the Q&A if you like. In this paper titled Risk is Feelings, my co-authors and I discuss how the emotions that are associated with risk-taking can both drive risk aversion, that is avoiding risks, and also risk-seeking. Basically what we say is that if you're afraid, if a particular risk induces fear in you, if it causes you to be fearful, you're going to avoid risks. And if it leads to excitement, you're going to be risk-seeking. So the people who gamble are people who get pleasure from gambling, and the people who backcountry ski are people who find that pleasurable. As Scott mentioned, I do a bunch of outdoor activities myself, and sometimes people say, oh, you're so risk-taking, but it doesn't really feel like I'm risk myself because I only do things that don't seem scary. And that's a general finding. So this risk is feelings perspective helps to explain when and why people take great risks, basically either because they get pleasure from them or they don't find them scary. And it also helps to explain who takes risks. It suggests that the people who take risks are the people who aren't made afraid by those risks. And as a result, risk takers often don't perceive themselves as taking risks because they don't experience fear. Okay, let me go back to the riddle. The riddle was, how is snow like a bunny rabbit? And here is the answer. I spent a year in the office next to a woman a researcher named Sue Meinecke. She did some very cool research. She took rhesus monkeys who had been raised in a laboratory, so they'd never seen either a snake or a rabbit. And they viewed a videotape of a grown, wild-reared rhesus monkey reacting fearfully to either a snake or to a rabbit. They doctored the video to make the grown monkey appear to be fearful of one or the other. The interesting finding was that the lab-reared monkeys, they'd never seen either a snake or a rabbit, they became instantly and permanently for the rest of their lives fear conditioned, that is, fearful of the snake. But they didn't become fearful of the rabbit. So it seems like somehow the snakes are kind of evolutionarily programmed into them at the level. If they see another monkey reacting fearfully to the snake, then they're going to be afraid of snakes from that point on. But it's really difficult to get a monkey to be afraid of a rabbit. Now, hopefully you understand what my answer to the riddle is. How is snow like a rabbit? My answer is that snow, which is white and fluffy, is not inherently frightening. And I think that's a big problem because if you've witnessed avalanches and the danger that they do, you know that snow is extremely frightening, but it's just not inherently frightening. It's a little bit like a rabbit in that respect. I think water is also, I do a lot of water sports. People just generally are not very afraid of water, which is a reason why people often don't insure themselves against floods. It's just hard to appreciate that the stuff that comes out of a faucet can be so dangerous. Okay, one line of research, this is perhaps the line of research that I'm best known for, is on empathy gaps. An empathy gap is the following idea. When you're in one affective state, when you're in one emotional state, it's very difficult to imagine yourself in a different state. So if you're not hungry, it's difficult to imagine yourself being hungry. If you're not in pain, it's very difficult to imagine yourself being in pain. And it works in reverse too. So like if you're very angry, it feels like you're going to be angry forever. It's very difficult to appreciate that you're going to cool off. Or if you're craving a drug, it feels like you're going to be craving the drug forever. So you might as well take the drug because the craving is not going to stop, even though we all know that craving does tend to stop. Here's a representative study I did of empathy gaps. That's the study that's probably closest to avalanche decision-making. This was done with a friend, Leif Van Boven. You can tell from his first name, Leif, that he was a child of hippies. Anyway, his wife worked in a private gym, so he took advantage of that. And when people came into the gym, we asked them if they would complete a short survey for us. And they had to be planning a vigorous cardiovascular workout lasting at least 20 minutes. In this study, we randomly assigned people to one of two experimental conditions, either to complete the survey before they exercised when they were unlikely to be thirsty, or after they exercised when they were very likely to be thirsty. And here's what we asked them. We asked them to imagine 3 vacationers in Colorado who went on a hike, and then they realized that they were lost and they hadn't packed well for the short hike, so they didn't have very much food or water. So the first thing we asked them to do was take the perspective of one of the hikers and describe your situation, how you got into it and how you feel both mentally and physically. And then we asked people, which do you think is most unpleasant for the lost hikers, their hunger or their thirst? What do you think the hikers regretted not packing more water or food? And then we asked them how they would feel in that situation. And we also asked them how hungry and thirsty and warm they were personally. Of course, people who had just exercised reported that they were more thirsty and warm, and they actually also reported that they were a little bit less hungry. The first thing we looked at was the essay that they wrote, and we wanted to see, would they mention thirst first or would they mention hunger first? And if we caught them after they exercised, when they personally were thirsty, they were more likely to mention thirst before they mentioned hunger. It was like more present in the top of their mind. And then we asked them these questions about which was more unpleasant. So it looks to me like a whole lot of you are experienced outdoors people. And so you know very well that thirst is a whole lot worse than hunger in the outdoors. But, and our experimental subjects understood that to some degree as well, but they understood it a whole lot better after they had exercised because they were in touch with being thirsty than before they exercised. We did what's called a path analysis, and what we found that people, when people predicted how the hikers would feel, the way they did that was they first predicted how they would feel and then they extrapolated to the hikers. That's how you predict how other people will feel. You first try to think, how would I feel in that situation? Another thing that we found is that people, in general, we find that people mispredict other people because they mispredict themselves. And finally, I should mention that this finding, our finding, was replicated with preschool children at the University of Oregon. They had the children pack a snack for the following day that they were going to go on a field trip and they had to pack a snack. But half of the children were first given 4 saltines to eat. So saltines, as the name sounds, are salty crackers, and salt, of course, makes you thirsty. So half of the children were thirstier than the other half. And as consistent with this notion of an empathy gap, the school children who were thirstier when they packed for the lunch for their following day were more likely to pack juice and than the children who were not thirsty. One implication of empathy gaps is when you're experiencing the exhilaration of backcountry sports, it's very difficult to get into the mindset of an avalanche. It's very difficult to imagine the terror of getting hit by one or the fear and misery of being trapped by one. So when you're in this situation, it's very difficult to imagine this situation, and that is caused by empathy gaps. Another line of research that I think is relevant to avalanche decision-making, it goes by the title Decisions from Experience. Like often when decision researchers do research on risk-taking, we give people, the risks involve things like coin flips or die rolls. But in the real world, unlike those situations, probabilities are often not known. And this is true certainly for avalanche risks. People don't know what the risks are. And generally, people tend to learn what the avalanche risks are from their own experience. That's called decision from experience. And there's a lot of evidence from research on decision from experience that people tend to underweigh, pay too little attention to small probabilities when they learn those probabilities from experience. One reason that they underweigh small risks is that they very often don't experience those risks. So they aren't really learning about the risks because they don't experience them. Robin Hogarth, my former colleague when I was at the University of Chicago, he coined the term a wicked learning environment to represent situations that have a great downsides, like for example, avalanche decision-making, in which individuals don't get the feedback that they need to make high-quality decisions. And avalanche-related decision-making is the paradigm of a wicked learning environment. Let me just mention that criminal justice policies in the United States, which rely on inconsistently applied, very severe sentences like long prison sentences, is another really good example that illustrates the point. We just have a very misguided criminal justice system, and in which often people's first learning experience puts them behind bars for a long period. Okay, continuing on to another relevant decision phenomenon. This is called near-miss effects. This is actually based on very recent research that my colleagues and I have been doing. In a lot of situations, people don't actually experience the negative outcomes to learn from them. That is, you don't actually go down the avalanche, but you can come very close to being in an avalanche. And this research that we're doing on near-miss effects shows that when people feel like they come close to experiencing a negative outcome, they become more risk averse. They're less likely to take risks. And to study near-miss effects, we use something called the Balloon Analog Risk Task, or the BART. Here it is. Here's a little balloon. And the way it works, and this is a recent experiment we ran, every time that you pump this balloon, every time you click on the green button, the balloon gets a little bit bigger, and you're intense. The likelihood of popping, in the same way that as a balloon expands, it becomes more likely to pop. The likelihood of popping increases the more that you expand the balloon. If you end up popping your balloon, you lose your earnings. So your goal is to pump the balloon as much as possible, but to stop before you pop the balloon. Here's a subject. They're pumping the balloon. As you can see, the balloon is getting larger. And then they stop and they press stop. And then the survey tells them, because this is an experiment on near misses, they get told by the survey, click the pump button to see how close you were to exploding the balloon. These pumps will not count toward your total payment. They've already made their money, but we tell them how close they came to popping the balloon. And here's the feedback they get. When they get feedback, they are in this situation. So this person had popped their balloon 20 times, if you remember. They earned 40 cents. And now they're in the second part of the experiment where they can check how close they came to popping the balloon. So here they're checking it. They're inflating the balloon some more until the balloon finally pops. And then it tells them you pumped the balloon 20 times and made 40 cents. The balloon's explosion point was 48 pumps. The maximum you could have earned on this round is 94 cents. So that's how the experiment goes. And here's what we find. When we have them do this balloon task 2 times, and when we don't give them any feedback at all, they tend to take slightly greater risks. They pump the balloon up a little bit more the second time when they don't get any feedback. When they get near-miss feedback, what you see is that they reduce their risk-taking. They take fewer risks in the second round, but also when they are very far from pumping their balloon, then they take greater risks. So far misses, we find, is actually worse than no feedback at all. A thing about near misses is the reduction in risk taking due to near misses doesn't seem to last very long. Like if you think about you're on the highway and you pass either like a gruesome wreck and you pass it a few minutes after it occurred, that's a near miss. And what do you do afterwards? You slow down, right? But how long does that last? It doesn't usually last very long. All right, so that's near misses, on to sunk costs. Backcountry skiing and a lot of other outdoor activities require, for a lot of people, huge investments in time and money. For example, planning, equipment purchases, travel. If I want to go backcountry skiing, I have to go, given that it doesn't snow in Pennsylvania anymore, I have to go out west, and that's very expensive and on a lot of different dimensions. And there's a lot of research on sunk costs, what's called the sunk cost fallacy, which shows that like logically, when people make decisions, they should just think about future costs and future benefits, but that's not what actually happens. Once people have invested in something, they're very reluctant to walk away from their investment, even when conditions sour, in the sense that the conditions suggest that it's no longer beneficial to, for example, go skiing. So skiing is an area where when plan to ski, very often people plan to ski, they incur all of these costs, and then the conditions end up being more adverse than anticipated. That would be a classic example in which sunk costs would lead people to take risks that they shouldn't take because they are pursuing these risks, these costs. There's a nice newspaper article about the Cherry Bowl avalanche disaster, in which one of the survivors, named Anik Chase, mentioned when she was interviewed, you drive 12 hours to Terrence, so we want to ski, kind of explaining why they went down in these bad conditions. A topic that I've become very interested in recently and have been doing a whole lot of research on is boredom. I'm really interested in what function does boredom serve and what are the consequences of boredom. Activities like backcountry skiing and mountaineering, which I used to do a lot of, often involve long, tedious approaches or sitting in a hut waiting for good snow conditions. And in those situations are often extremely boredom inducing. And there's a lot of research showing that boredom tends to promote risk-taking. My own personal experience is that in situations where I've been very exhilarated, like for example, whitewater canoeing, very exhilarated, and suddenly there's a drop in risk, like the river flattens out. That's often a situation where I'm likely to take a really stupid risk because you kind of get acclimated to the risk and then you feel let down or bored when the risk ends. And I think both sunk costs and boredom can lead people to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't and then they probably shouldn't. And both of these factors interact with a phenomenon that's sometimes known as wishful thinking, which is if you really want to believe something, you can often persuade yourself that what you want to believe is true. And here is a avalanche, the rating from an avalanche app telling you how dangerous the conditions are. And another quote from Anik Chase, and who was a survivor of the Cherry Bowl. And she said, we looked at the snow report and it was saying considerable. But for me, the word considerable is not dangerous. I don't know why. You just consider it. I actually think that that might be a limitation of this app, that she's right. Considerable just does not sound very scary, even though considerable is intended to say that the risk is substantial. But I think also what you're seeing in this quote is she really wanted to go skiing. So she decided to interpret the word considerable in a fashion that would kind of license her to go do the skiing that she wanted to do. Another phenomenon that I think plays an important role in a lot of outdoor activities has to do with the power of goals. In a really old old research paper I wrote, we looked at the behavior of New York City cab drivers. Suppose you're a cab driver, and suppose that there are high wage days and low wage days, and you can decide how long to drive. Does it make more sense to drive a long day on a high wage day? Let's say that might be a rainy day. There's a lot of people out on the street. And anyway, it's no fun to be at home anyway because it's raining. Does it make sense to drive a long hours on a high wage day or on a low wage day? One of the, if you raise your hand, you on the board, if the answer is on a high wage day. You should, that's correct. You should be all raising your hand. It makes more sense to drive long hours on a high wage day, on high wage days, because you can earn more money and work fewer hours by doing that. But we found that that cab drivers exhibited exactly the opposite pattern. They tended to work long hours on low wage days and quit early on high wage days. Why did they do that? Because they had a daily goal, a daily earnings goal that they were trying to achieve. And it took them longer to achieve it on a low wage day. And that's one piece of research among many that shows the power of goals. Here's another piece of research in which the researcher looked at marathon times. And you might think that marathon finishing times would follow a nice normal, what's called a normal smooth curve, but the curve doesn't look like that. What you see is these spikes. And if you look more closely, the spikes, what you see is a big accumulation of times just below 4 hours, just below 3 hours and 30 minutes, just below 3 hours, and so on. And that's a testament to the power of goals. Like some marathon runners tend to have round number goals, and then they run fast enough to just achieve the goal that they set for themselves. What's the relevance of goals for backcountry skiers? Well, backcountry skiers tend to have goals, like for example, to ski a particular mountain, and they tend to bracket at the daily level. So they want to ski a particular mountain on a particular day. Here's some example. This is from a paper that I wrote on mountaineering in 1999. After dislocating his shoulder and almost dying in an accident on K2, which is one of the most challenging mountains on Earth, Scott Fischer went on to climb the peak. Scott Potterfield writes that most people in his situation probably would have bagged it and gone home, but Fischer possessed an almost irrational drive to get to the top of the mountains he climbed. Fischer later died in a particularly deadly year, 1996, on Mount Everest. In 1996, in fact, on that Everest season, when a lot of people died, Doug Hansen died after summiting at 4 p.m., which is at least 2 hours after the pre-specified turnback time. Hansen had attempted to climb the mountain 1 year earlier, come within 300 vertical feet of the summit when he had to turn back. According to Krakauer, who wrote Into Thin Air and documented this, his earlier failure had come to possess him, take hold of his life and control his every waking moment. And he came back this year vowing that under no circumstance was he going to allow himself to be turned around again. Krakauer refers to this effect as summit fever, that it consumes mountaineers when they're within striking distance of a peak, whatever their turn back time. But I hope it's obvious what the relevance is for avalanche decision-making. If you are a backcountry skier and you have a particular goal, it's very difficult to give up on the goal, even when the conditions should warrant doing so. Getting close to the end of the list, another broad set of phenomena have to do with peer effects or social facilitation. There's a lot of research findings, for example, that the presence of peers in a car radically increased teenage accidents. So this is the driver's age in years and the deaths per 10 million trips. And you can see that the more kids who are in the car, the more risky it is. And it's easy to understand why that is. Like, kids like to show off to their peers. Interestingly, for the age group that's probably more relevant for backcountry skiers, you don't see these effects. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that peer effects could be important in other domains, including avalanche safety. My own perception from reading the different news stories about people, avalanche accidents, is that peer effects and social facilitation do in fact play a role. And a lot of accounts of avalanche disasters feature social factors prominently. Jordy Hendricks in his talk to CARE noted that in 90% of avalanche accidents, the victim or a member of the victim's group triggers the event. And going back to another New York Times article about another avalanche disaster, Tunnel Creek. Tunnel Creek, it was like a holy grail for Chris. Hesberg said it was where he wanted to show off for friends. Another quote from the same article, it was kind of like, all right, this group is getting bigger. Castillo said, I wouldn't pop in with a bunch of no names necessarily and trust any of them, but the ones I knew were definitely qualified to go, and they're not going to bring people out who aren't. So Castillo was just assuming, since he knew the names of some people, that those people wouldn't be bringing people into the party who weren't qualified to deal with the conditions. So I think peer effects are often very important. The final topic that I want to talk about is conflicts of interest. I added that after Scott told me who my audience was going to be. I spent about almost a decade of my professional career studying conflicts of interest, mostly conflicts of interest in that are faced by physicians. So professionals often face conflicts of interest. These are situations in which their professional responsibilities clash with their own economic interests, which could be personal or institutional. So physicians, for example, if you get into an accident and you go to see an orthopedist, very often the orthopedist who you go to see and who's going to tell you whether you need to get an operation is the very person who's going to give you the operation and profit from it. So my strong recommendation is if you go to an orthopedist, get a second opinion from a physician who's not going to be the one to do the operation. I've had operations recommended to me by physicians probably about 5 times. I never followed their advice, and I'm still going into the back country. So be very wary of physicians with conflicts. The same is true for accountants. In these situations, there's a huge amount of research which suggests that economic incentives can distort judgments. For example, physicians decide that questionable tests and procedures that they or their institutions profits from are actually beneficial for their patients. They're able to convince themselves, oh yeah, this is good for my patient, even though the real reason that they're doing it is because they're going to profit from the procedure. There's some really horrible stuff in this field, like for example, oncologists who profit from the chemotherapy they administer about 50% more drugs if they profit from the drugs that they are administering. This makes you very wary of physicians, I've got to say. Auditors become blind to the signs of problems in the books of companies that their firm is auditing if they're also providing consulting services to them, or even just the fact that the companies hire and can fire their auditors, even that causes problems for auditors, which is why good accountants often do bad audits. What about avalanche experts? Scott, in one of his emails, Scott told me about some of the conflicts faced by avalanche experts. Avalanche makers and mitigators who work at ski areas or highway programs have to make binary decisions to open or close ski runs or highways. And there is substantial pressure to keep things open due to loss aversion, sunk costs, pride, ego, or open terrain or roads after they've been closed due to pressure, pride, and ego. Scott continued, typically the pressure is from within. It's not financial pressure, it's from within yourself and your peers, not from above. but the cost of keeping major interstates closed is very significant. It's been estimated for some interstates like I-70 in Colorado, I guess, could be up to $1 million an hour in lost revenue. And when the highway folks are getting calls from governors, there's pressure from above. So it does seem like a lot of you who are listening to this talk do face similar conflicts to the doctors and the auditors. Andrea, when she gave me comments on this presentation, she talked about guides. She said that guides make a living on giving people pleasurable experiences, and people often hire guides to ride terrain that they otherwise would not dare to ride. At the same time, they probably want to minimize their own exposure, since first, guides have a high cumulative risk exposure. Maybe the person who you bring out is only going out once or twice, but you're going out repeatedly, and so your risk is cumulative. And second, an accident would destroy your reputation. So a problem arises because the low probability of an avalanche accident means that a safe guide, a sensible guide, risks losing customers if these customers see that others rode steeper terrain that they didn't, than they did. Not that they did, then they did, and nothing bad happened. And the customer may find it difficult to appreciate the danger for all the snow rabbit reasons, that is, because snow is fluffy and white. And finally, the customer does not have as high a cumulative risk exposure as the guide. So my point is that we might think about physicians and auditors as facing all these financial and other types of pressures that create these conflicts between safety and other types of considerations. But it really seems like the types of people who are on this call, you also often face conflicts. What's the remedy for conflict of interest? One that I find useful is, like I mentioned, when I go to a physician and the physician recommends that I get some kind of operation, I'll always get a second opinion from somebody who isn't going to profit from that decision. And so maybe in the domain of avalanches, it might be really useful to assign go, no-go decisions to independent decision makers who are not experiencing the same pressures that a guide or a risk manager might be exposed to. Okay, I think I'm exactly on time. And let me close with the snow hair and say thank you for listening to the talk, and I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you so much, George. I'm wondering, let's see, let me get the chat up here.
Yeah, thanks, George. That was just terrific. So we're very fortunate to have George here with us so we can get some questions. So we'll give you some time to think, and please get going on your questions. You can raise your hand. There's somebody. Hang on.
So George, I've got a question here for you.
Yep.
Something that you brought up on the goals and the reference to the John Krakauer Summit Fever.
Yep.
It's really common with avalanche professionals. So whether it's, guides who have customers that want to ski big peaks or get great snow, or with, say, ski area workers who, are really driven to open terrain, to open that run that everyone wants to ski. So how might you suggest that we combat that in a workplace environment, both kind of from an individual standpoint and maybe from an operational standpoint? Do you have any tricks or tools to combat the power of goals?
Well, I mean, I think the reason that there's often a fixed turnback time is exactly because we all know that once you can see the peak in front of you, it's almost irresistibly tempting to turn back. And so I think that the turnback time is kind of like what we decision researchers call a self-control device. It's like not keeping candy or high-calorie snacks in your house, or putting the alarm clock across the room if you have trouble sleeping in. And so I think the turnback time serves that function. It's probably really important to tell clients ahead of time what your rules are, what your risk limiting rules are, so they're not caught by surprise. So it doesn't seem sort of random, like you just like they don't think that you just want to go home and watch TV or something like that. So that's one thing. When it comes to, and in a lot of other situations, like what I mentioned with the conflict of interest, it's often very useful to try to get an opinion from someone who isn't too caught up in a situation. And so, like, for example, in companies, let's say the company makes some kind of an investment and it turns out to be a bad investment. And there's a big temptation to throw, for the CEO of a company to throw good money, or for the person who made the investment, let's say, to throw good money after bad money. And that's classic sunk cost effect. And a remedy that's often used in this situation is to remove the original decision maker from the situation and replace the decision maker with a new decision maker who didn't make the original investment, because they're going to be more dispassionate. So for some of the types of decisions that you just mentioned, it may be possible to get advice from someone who isn't so close to the situation. And in other situations, it's just really important to truly, I mean, I've gotten into awful situations by not following my own turn back time, but I'm sure we all know, I've had experiences like that. But it is really important to honor things like turn back times, and also to alert clients well ahead of time to what those rules are.
Awesome. Thanks, George. Here we have a live question from Ian Hoyer. Can we get Ian up there, Dan?
Ian, you should be able to unmute yourself at this point.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks, George. That was super interesting. I had a question. You talked about how far misses were worse than no feedback at all in that balloon experiment.
Yeah.
And that just really, was interesting to me from an avalanche perspective of, we in this wicked environment, we oftentimes use case studies sort of as substitutes for near misses, trying to make them near misses. And do you have any thoughts, about case studies, and can they be useful to substitute? And what makes a near miss versus a far miss? How can we make sure that they're not actually increasing people's risk tolerance?
Right. This is a big problem, that the fact that the far misses actually make people more risk-seeking. I've seen this phenomenon in a wide range of my research. I've done some research, for example, on torture, and you give, is a particular practice like waterboarding, is that interrogation or is that torture? And you might think that if somebody had experienced a certain kind of torture or misery before, that they would be more empathetic and more, but people are actually less empathetic towards things that they've experienced before, because they say to themselves, oh, I've experienced that, but because of the empathy gap, you can't really remember what it was like, how scary it was. So people, often the people who you would think would be the most in touch with different risks are actually the least in touch. And I think maybe that might have something to do with what's going on with these far misses. You see an avalanche and you're very far away from it, and you think, okay, that was an avalanche. It wasn't really very scary, so maybe avalanches really aren't so bad. I mean, I have no idea. This is laboratory research. I have no idea whether the findings on far misses would extend to avalanche kinds of situations. But certainly, as you kind of hinted, the implication of the research would be that having actual experience, not in being in an avalanche or very close to one, but just like witnessing avalanches from a distance, might end up having exactly the opposite effects of what it should have.
Excellent. Thanks, George.
That's a good question.
Thanks, Ian. So we have a written question here from Don Sheriff, and you got it a little bit of this before, George, with one of your answers, but Don asks, the remedy of having an independent or disinterested party make the decision to avoid conflict of interest is oftentimes impractical or impossible in the field. So what do you think of the concept of making your deals early and having operational cues delineated beforehand to assist decision-making when in the moment, when you're in that hot state?
Absolutely. Having some bright line rules is really the other possible approach. One is to bring in independent decision makers, and the other is to have these very well-defined bright line rules that are to prevent yourself from getting caught up in these situations. And the turn back time is an example of that. But I'm sure you have all sorts of, like with the app now, which is telling you about avalanche risks in areas that you are likely to be skiing in, or that you're perhaps with clients. Perhaps a bright line rule could be never go down a slope where the risk is, except by yourself perhaps, but not with a client, where the risk is considerable or greater. That might be an example of a bright line rule. But if you don't have either independent decision makers or these kinds of bright line rules that are very well defined and that are chosen ahead of time, it's very likely you're going to get caught up in the emotions of the situation, the boredom, sunk costs, empathy gap, and so on. And that's when you are really at risk for doing something that you might end up regretting.
Great,
Thank you,
thanks for
George.
that. Thanks for the question.
We got a live question from Blaze Reardon now. Blaze, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks. George, back to the wicked environment and the question of developing expertise when it's really easy, or when you're more likely to get poor feedback. Is it possible to develop expertise in a wicked environment? And if so, what are some strategies or practices that promote the development of expertise?
Well, I don't think that avalanche accidents are very common with guides. So I'm assuming that you must have developed some pretty good methods. But I would think the problem with learning about probabilities from experience is that you very, very rarely experience the negative outcome. And if there's, however, if you're engaged in some kind of training, then presumably you want to expose somebody when they are training to periodic adverse consequences. So as long as, I mean, the problem with the learning from experience is that you never experience the adverse consequence. And this is not a very good answer. I think it's a big challenge. I mean, I know you guys are have great expertise and very, very rarely put clients in danger. So you have probably figured it out. But it is the case that the research on learning in wicked environments does suggest that there's going to be a tendency in learning from experience in wicked environments. There's going to be a tendency to take increasing risks over time. So I'm not sure how you've solved it, but you're absolutely right that that is a big risk in this kind of situation.
Great, thanks, George. We have a written question here that's kind of a little bit of a follow-up to one of the earlier ones. So how do you see the value of literature describing prior accidents as presented in Accidents in North American Mountaineering or the Snowy Torrents, which is a book compiling case studies on avalanche accidents? How do you compare to up close and real life, visceral near misses? Is there value in reading these case studies, or is the reading ephemeral?
I do think you can get some useful information from reading these different cases. Of course, you can find out what are the conditions that are most likely to lead to an accident and so on. But I do think that there's a hazard to reading them too, because for every accident, there's always some reason why the accident occurred. And you can always tell yourself a story about why you would not do whatever the people who had the accident did. And so paradoxically, reading about accidents, because for every accident you read about, you can think, oh, that's not me, that's not me. Paradoxically, reading about accidents make you feel like you are less at risk rather than more at risk, which is what reading about accidents should do. So I think reading about accidents has really two sides. On the one hand, it does provide valuable information. On the other hand, it can kind of paradoxically and perversely make you feel more invincible and make you personally more likely to take risks and actually get into an accident. So I think there's really two sides there.
Are there any tricks to preventing that kind of creating that narrative fallacy where you have the mindset of, well, yeah, this won't happen to me? Are there any ways that you can combat that, do you think?
I mean, in the years when I was doing research on empathy gaps, people were always asking me that question. And I think it's beyond the human brain to be able to, when you're in one emotional state, it's beyond the capacity of the human brain to imagine how you would feel or behave in a different emotional state. The reason is that emotions kind of reprogram your brain. When you're in a different emotional state, it's as if you are a different person. And so when you're reading about these accidents in a cool state, it's not really going to help you very much to anticipate what it would be like to be in an avalanche, to experience those consequences. And that's why reading about accidents can have perverse effects. I think the answer, like if you think about the case of putting the alarm clock, you sleep in, putting the alarm clock across the room, I don't think you can ever learn when you're falling asleep, you can never imagine how painful it will be to wake up if you're a person who has trouble waking up in the morning. You'll never learn that. All you can learn is, oh, I keep waking up in the morning and shutting off my alarm clock, and it's not working. It's not working just to have the alarm clock next to my bed. And so I have to put it across the room. So I don't think it's possible to surmount empathy gaps, but it is possible to learn from your experience and take actions to avoid the negative consequences of empathy gaps. And that brings us back once again to the bright line rules, the turn back times, using people who aren't caught up in the emotions of the situation to give you guidance and so on.
Right. Well, I guess thanks for the bad news, right? So we kind of have a follow-up here from to Ian Hoyer. His was the first question. This is from Kelly. So how would you interpret backcountry users who have an intimate experience with an avalanche and become immune or a greater or equal risk taker? So
yeah.
I think they're asking, so like
I think that's really, this goes back to what I said about torture. Like very often people who have experienced torture are the worst torturers. And very often, like people who have been bullied become really bad bullies themselves. And I think the problem is, unless you are actually in the avalanche situation, which occurs very, very rarely, and you're very likely to not survive it, unless you're actually in this situation as a result of this empathy gap, it's very difficult to imagine the misery, the fear, all the emotions that you're going to experience. And so suppose that you've actually been in an avalanche and you survived it, it's very likely that you'll think, oh, I've been in an avalanche, and it wasn't so bad. Not remembering, and you're not going to remember as a result of the empathy gap. You're not going to remember just how scary and miserable it was. So perversely, and we keep finding this in our research, perversely, it can be exactly the people who have experienced it in the past who learn exactly the wrong lesson from that experience, because they can't remember the fear and the misery. All they remember is that I was in that situation. Oh, and it wasn't so bad. So I think that's the answer to the question, that this empathy gap can lead to perverse learning from experience. And it doesn't help that you had the experience in the past. That doesn't make you a better decision maker. In fact, weirdly enough, it might make you a worse decision maker.
Interesting. Well, our next question is from an Avalanche educator, from Dennis. He's asking, how can we teach Avalanche students to work around these problems without asking them to psychoanalyze their peers on the skin track?
I mean, it's a very difficult problem. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what maybe you on the board who I can see, what would be your answer to how do you, I mean, I took avalanche training one time, and we had to use the beacon to try to find a body that was buried in the snow. But I have to say, my own experiences, it all felt pretty abstract, and I'm not sure whether it would affect, if I were on the top of a slope and it looked really beautiful, I'm not sure if it would affect my own risk-taking. Any ideas from you who are who I can see on the Zoom about how you can train people in this kind of situation?
I'm not quite sure that you can actually train them other than to get them to communicate with each other and sort of discuss what risk-taking they want to take.
That's right. I mean, it's really, really difficult to prepare people for the types of situations that they're likely to experience in the real world. I mean, if you think of something like firefighters, they get a lot of hands-on training dealing with actual fires. But guides hopefully get very little training dealing with actual avalanches, and the people they guide have even less experience. And so it's a situation where you're suddenly, even the guide is suddenly thrust into a very emotional, scary, unfamiliar situation. It's really difficult to train people to behave ideally in those situations. I guess the best thing you can do is just rehearse, so that the response is almost automatic, even when you are in a high stress situation.
Yeah.
All right. So, George, we have a question here from Josh. He says, thank you, George. That was extremely relevant and thought-provoking. Do you have a Swiss cheese model or tool for risk management that you utilize personally that takes into account the specific topics that you discussed?
I mean, so often I study decision making, and I so often ponder how studying decision making doesn't make you a better decision maker at all. My department at the university is called the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. That's the department I'm in. But one time somebody addressed a letter to me to the Department of Social Indecision Sciences. And if I think about myself and my colleague, a lot of us are very indecisive, and we're not really very good decision makers. I wish I could say that studying this stuff is really helpful, like it helps you to make better decisions. But I can't say that, nor can I even say that studying empathy gaps makes me better able to predict how I'm going to feel or behave in emotion-inducing situations. So I guess another pessimistic answer to that question. But hopefully, once again, you guys and women have it all figured out. That's all I can hope.
All right. The next question. So are there any studies on the empathy gap where pre-mortem or what if techniques were used to close the gap or attempt to close the gap?
Let's see. I mean, in the study on torture, we found was that, so we asked people, is putting someone in a cold room, for example, is that interrogation or is that torture? And of course, torture is not lawful under many, many different international treaties, but interrogation is. And so for half of the people, we asked everyone that question, but for half the people, we'd have them put their hand in ice cold water for a couple of minutes before they answered the question. And then they were much more likely to say, oh yes, putting somebody in a cold room is torture. And we did that for we gave people kind of a little taste of misery, and it transformed their evaluations of whether related things were experiences should be classified as interrogation or torture. What I take away from that is that if you can, it is really important to get people into an emotional state for them to imagine what it would be like in the emotional state. But sometimes it only takes a little bit of emotion to get them to empathize with or appreciate a much stronger emotion. So a little bit of your hand in cold water to appreciate the much greater misery of what it would be like to be in a cold room. So I would say the best technique for bridging empathy gaps is to give people a little taste of the relevant emotion. Maybe as a guide, perhaps you could accidentally drop somebody into a crevasse on a rope, but catch them. And from that point on, as a mountain guide, it's likely, I don't know from that point on, but that's likely to kind of give them a true appreciation of just how dangerous crevasses are, something like that. So a taste of emotion can go a long way.
Excellent. The next question from John Sykes. Do you think simulation training, such as online decision-making scenarios, are an effective tool to develop experience in a wicked environment where we have less exposure to real-world hazards, so in the tools?
Oh, is the question, do I think it is?
Yeah, so do you think
I think again, to the degree that these simulations lead you to automate behaviors so that that the behaviors are going to unfold even when you're in a very high emotional state, I would say yes, the simulations are very good. But to the extent that they make you think that you are prepared for the real situation, that can be really bad. My colleague, Leif, the one with whom I did that study about the exercise, he had a student who was blind, and he told me about how his blind student told him that people often, students, like high school students or college students, if they want to know what it's like to be blind, so what they do is they put on a blindfold and they kind of grope around. And his blind student said so that's kind of a symptom. His blind student said, actually, that simulation leads people to understand less what it's like to be blind. That because for a blind person, according to Leif's student, for a blind person, navigating isn't really the big issue. The big issue might be you'll never know what your grandchildren look like or what your spouse looks like, and so the simulation, putting a blindfold on you and groping around, makes you think that you understand what it's like to be blind, but it actually makes you understand what it's like to be blind even less than if you hadn't done the simulation. And I think that's the possible downside of a simulation. If it makes you think you are prepared for a situation that you aren't really prepared for, that could be a negative. On the other hand, if it teaches you to kind of automatic skills that you can use if you get into a difficult situation, that would be very valuable. So I think there have been different versions. A whole bunch of your questions have been different versions of this question, but really my answer is that a lot of these things can have two sides. They can have benefits, but they can also have surprising perverse effects.
Interesting. So we have a live question from Dave Zinn. Dave, you out there?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, awesome. George, thanks again for spending your evening with us. That was a great presentation. Hopefully this isn't trying to rehash the same thing too much here, but I kind of want to go back to the information about near misses and far misses that you were discussing and just ask it in a more open-ended way. We've kind of asked you about case studies and simulation training, but I'm just wondering, is there any studies that you've done or that you're aware of about how that could be harnessed to make education about these risky environments more effective?
I mean, it's very tricky. I mean, something I've done a lot of research on is addiction. And big riddle is like, why do people start to take addictive drugs? Well, with the prescription drug crisis, a lot of people are in pain, but ignoring that, why do people start taking addictive drugs? And I think a big reason is it's impossible to imagine the force of craving a drug when you aren't craving a drug. And so that people think it's just and so people start taking drugs not without a full appreciation of the danger of taking drugs. I sometimes ask my students, suppose you became addicted to heroin, do you think you could ever like steal from your parents or abandon your children? No, there's no way I'd ever do that. But if they got addicted, they would do that. And so I think it's exactly the same problem. It's really difficult to teach people to be properly afraid of things that they aren't naturally afraid of. And even my research even suggests that giving them a fear experience will not necessarily lead them to take fewer risks. It might even lead them to take more risks. So it might occur to you that you should expose them to some scary situation and then they're not going to take risks. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I guess, I'm sorry that I'm so unable to provide, it's like, you're making me, all of these questions are making me think I need to think more carefully about this. There must be an answer to this question. But let me just say that all of my research suggests that there is no simple answer to the question. Even exposing somebody to a pretty close simulation of a risk, something that induces fear, will not necessarily lead them to be more risk avoiding in the future. Again, I think, I mean, even in the research on near misses, we were really curious about whether the mechanism driving the near misses, the near miss effect, was more kind of emotional or more cognitive. Like the story I told about driving past the wreck on the road, that kind of suggests that it might be emotional. So in those experiments, we've run a bunch of versions where we expose somebody to needs, and then we have them do something else for an hour, and then they come back and do the balloon task a second time. And if it's about emotion, then you would think that the effect would kind of wear off over time. And that's not what we observe. It seems to be the evidence is more consistent that the near miss causes people to learn to change their view of the kind of objective probabilities in the situation. And maybe that's the best that you can do to give people just some kind of a realistic, objective sense of what the probabilities are of having an accident if you engage in certain behaviors.
All right. We have a kind of a follow-up question. You started talking a little bit about addiction a minute or two ago. So George D'Angelo asks, are there any correlations between addiction and wicked learning environments? Or any relation between the two?
I mean, I think addiction is a very bad learning environment for reasons that are a little bit different from why wicked learning environments are bad. So wicked learning environments, often you just aren't getting the relevant feedback because you're not experiencing the negative outcome. And well, I guess you could say that addiction is also a wicked environment in the sense that if you are taking a drug, like let's say if you are young and you start smoking and you have free access to cigarettes, you aren't going to, the moment you want a cigarette, you'll take a cigarette. So you don't end up experiencing the craving very often until it's too late, when you can't, the craving of not being able to get the drug. So in a lot of situations of addiction, you have free access to the drug. And so the drug is giving you pleasure and you're not experiencing the craving because you're able to get access to the drug. And then one day you can't get access to it. It's too expensive and or for some reason you can't get the drug. And only then do you realize how dependent you are on the drug. So I guess you could say that addiction can be also a wicked learning environment in the sense that you often don't get the feedback you need until it's too late.
Okay, thanks, George. So we have a question from Mark Staples. It seems from this talk that the deck is stacked against us, but it also seems like we do pretty well. Both professionals and the public seem to make a lot of good decisions. Maybe I'm wrong and we're just lucky, but I truly believe that we're doing a lot right. If that's true, what is it that we are doing right as avalanche educators? And what is it that we are doing right as individuals? Or how do we determine what we're doing right?
Well, I think that like for example, guides, backcountry guides are people who, I mean, you do have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, and you understand that the risks are cumulative, and if you are still alive, it's a good chance that you have probably been reasonable when you take risks. I mean, if you look at mountaineers, the death rate among mountaineers is absolutely staggering. One of the books I read when I wrote that article about mountaineering was titled "This Game of Ghosts," and it was it was by a mountaineer about all of his friends that had died, like a huge fraction of his friends. Guides seem to do a whole lot better than people who are taking risks on their own account. And I guess there's more of a ethic among guides. Maybe there's more of an appreciation that a guide can't put their client into the same risks that they would expose themselves to. But I think my guess is that a lot of guides are probably not nearly as safe when they're off doing the backcountry travel by themselves as they are when they are with clients. But certainly, I certainly agree with the thrust of the question, which is that you who are managing avalanche risks in different ways, like making decisions about closing highways, making decisions about what terrain to take clients on, it does seem like you've got it figured out. Like, and so you are not, and I'm not in those occupations. I'm not exactly sure how you do it, but probably I would assume that you're probably, if you're a guide, you're looking at the app and you are using some rules of thumb to make decisions. And that's all I can say, because, but I applaud you and commend you for keeping the public and you're keeping your clients so safe. I just signed up. I've gotten too old to go mountaineering myself, but I've signed up to with a guide to climb Mount Shuksan in July, which I'm very excited about. But I have great confidence that I'm not going to be in the same kind of danger that I used to put myself into personally when I am traveling with this guide.
That's awesome. Well, hey, I think we don't want to keep you up too late here. It's starting to get late in Pennsylvania, George. So do you have any parting words for the crowd?
I guess what I just said, which is keep up the great work, and hopefully if you are a guide, maybe, who knows, maybe you'll end up with me as a client one of these days. Because as I get older, I more and more appreciate the value of having a guide. So, but, and Scott, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It was a very interesting experience, and you've actually given me a lot of ideas for things that I should be doing research on. So thank you.
Well, thank you, George, from all of us, the entire community. And we can definitely give you ideas on things to study anytime. We won't give you answers, but we can give you questions.
And yeah, thanks for the advice you gave on the Sawtooth. That was a spectacular route.
Oh, it was my
Fantastic.
pleasure.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well,
George,
with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
Well, George, on behalf of the American Avalanche Association, we really appreciate your time and participating tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, George. And before we close up, I'll remind everybody that this is a seminar series. And thanks to Scott and Eric and Ava, who've been organizing the speakers. We're planning on having it once a month through the winter, first Thursday of every month. So the next Thursday is December 3rd, I believe. So keep an eye on your email. I'll be announcing the next topic. And thanks again, George, for starting off our
really
virtual survey or virtual seminar series with such a great talk. We really appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, folks.
Night, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.